October 1944, Western Pacific, 23:18 hours. The night was thick enough to feel solid. Cloud cover erased the moon. The horizon dissolved into black water. Radar scopes glowed softly on Allied bridges, but visually the sea was an empty void. Sound carried farther than sight. Japanese escort vessels moved confidently through the darkness. They were trained for long-range engagement. Radar contacts were meant to be engaged at distance. Torpedoes launched from beyond visual confirmation. Gunnery solutions refined before closing. Doctrine favored measured engagement, range as protection. Distance meant control. Then a new contact appeared. Faint at first, moving faster than expected. The Allied cruiser did not hold back to trade long-range salvos. It did not drift cautiously at the edge of radar certainty. Instead, it accelerated, deliberately closing the gap while the darkness still favored confusion. On the Japanese scopes, the contact behaved strangely. It was not circling. It was not bracketing. It was charging. By the time recognition settled in, range had collapsed faster than Doctrine allowed. "Knife fight distance," one Allied gunnery officer muttered. The cruiser's captain had made a calculated decision: eliminate reaction time. At extreme range, Japanese ships were disciplined and deadly. Their torpedo spreads were devastating. Their fire control procedures were precise when given seconds to align. But at close range, inside expected engagement envelopes, procedure compresses, decisions must be instinctive, corrections shrink to moments. The Allied cruiser surged forward under minimal silhouette, engines pushing hard but steady. Radar fed constant updates. Gunnery crews stood ready not for ranging shots, but for immediate impact. At just over 3,000 yards, near point blank for warships of that size, the order came. Open fire. The cruiser's main battery erupted in rapid sequence, not probing shots, direct fire. Shells tore into the nearest Japanese escort before it could complete its turn to align torpedoes. Superstructure shattered. Bridge compartments erupted in flame. Secondary batteries joined instantly, stitching the target's deck with high-velocity impact. The violence was intimate. No long arcs. No waiting. Just steel crossing water in seconds. Japanese escorts attempted to respond, but alignment takes space. Turning arcs require distance. Torpedo angles need geometry. At this range, geometry evaporated. Another salvo from the Allied cruiser struck a second escort amidships. Fires blossomed, signals faltered, confusion spread through the formation. The shock was immediate, not just physical but doctrinal. This was not how the fight was supposed to unfold. The Allied cruiser had abandoned the safety of range and chosen proximity, where reaction cycles collapse and volume overwhelms planning. Searchlights flickered uncertainly. Some illuminated friendly hulls by mistake. Others hesitated, unwilling to expose position fully. The night that had promised concealment now amplified chaos. The cruiser did not slow. It pressed closer. Because at knife fight distance, speed and aggression replace caution. And caution was exactly what Japanese command had expected. On the Japanese escorts, the first reaction was procedural. Identify bearing. Confirm range. Prepare torpedoes spread. But procedure assumes time. At long range, ships can calculate. At medium range, they can adjust. At knife fight distance, there is only reaction. The Allied cruiser's first salvo had already torn through the lead escort's bridge before torpedo officers completed angle verification. Fire control teams scrambled to reorient, but the target was no longer approaching in a predictable arc. It was inside the envelope. A destroyer attempted to swing broadside to launch torpedoes, but the turn exposed its flank fully. The Allied cruiser's secondary battery opened immediately, fast-firing 5-inch guns hammering the hull with brutal efficiency. Radar directed at close range, corrections were nearly instantaneous. Metal screamed. Steam vented violently. Signal lamps went dark. Japanese crews were brave. They moved toward their stations under fire, but bravery cannot expand space that no longer exists. At 3,000 yards, shells travel in seconds. A second escort fired hurried torpedoes, but without coordinated timing, the spread lacked overlap. The Allied cruiser altered course sharply between salvos, its captain exploiting the compressed geometry. At close range, small heading changes translate into large solution errors for torpedoes. The torpedoes passed astern. Another cruiser-class broadside struck. This time, the impact ignited ready ammunition on an escort's deck. Flame leapt skyward, briefly illuminating the entire engagement in violent orange. For a heartbeat, every ship became visible, friend and enemy alike, frozen in the glare. Then darkness reclaimed them. Japanese command had expected distance to structure the battle. Instead, distance had vanished. Radio traffic spiked into confusion. Some captains interpreted the aggressive closure as multiple attackers. Others believed they were facing a destroyer squadron rather than a heavy cruiser pressing alone. That miscalculation mattered. Resources were misallocated, searchlights swept too wide, gunnery arcs overlapped inefficiently. The Allied cruiser exploited every hesitation. Instead of maintaining linear engagement, it cut across the formation's axis, forcing escorts to pivot individually rather than as a screen. Every pivot consumed seconds. Every second allowed another salvo. The fight no longer resembled doctrinal naval engagement. It resembled violence at arm's length. The Japanese ships were built for disciplined night torpedo warfare. They were lethal when allowed space and timing. They were vulnerable when forced to fight inside their own reaction window. By the time Japanese command fully recognized the cruiser's intention to collapse range deliberately, the escorts were already burning. The battle had not been decided by firepower alone. It had been decided by distance, or rather, by the deliberate destruction of it. For several chaotic minutes, Japanese command assumed they were facing multiple attackers. The speed of impact suggested a squadron. The overlapping flashes implied crossfire. The aggressive maneuvering felt coordinated beyond a single hull. But as radar plots stabilized, fragmented though they were, a realization began to form. There was only one consistent return. One heavy contact. Closing, turning, firing. One cruiser. That realization should have brought relief. It did not. Because by the time they understood it was a single Allied ship, 2 escorts were already disabled and a third was fighting uncontrolled fires. The shock was not numerical, it was tactical. How could one cruiser press this close? The answer was simple. Because it had chosen to. Japanese night doctrine emphasized patience and torpedo dominance. Engagements were structured around spacing. Destroyers would fan out. Torpedo spreads would be layered. Enemy ships would be forced to maneuver into kill zones. That doctrine assumed the enemy would remain at standoff distance. The Allied cruiser had refused that assumption. Instead of waiting to be bracketed, it had closed aggressively before torpedo geometry could mature. Inside 3,000 yards, the elegant mathematics of spread patterns degrade. Reaction time shrinks. Launch angles narrow. Confusion multiplies. And confusion now ruled. The cruiser cut across the formation again, this time even closer. Its main battery roared in disciplined sequence. At this range, radar correction was nearly instantaneous. The shells did not walk toward the target. They arrived on it. A Japanese destroyer attempting to align for torpedo fire found itself bracketed within seconds. The bridge was hit first. Steering faltered. the vessel drifted half a degree off heading, just enough to ruin the launch solution. Another salvo struck aft. The destroyer fell silent. Searchlights finally found the Allied cruiser fully, illuminating its superstructure in harsh white beams. For a moment, the knife fight became visible, one cruiser charging through smoke, guns flashing rhythmically. But illumination cuts both ways. The cruiser's gunners adjusted instantly. Secondary batteries answered the searchlights with punishing precision. One beam snapped out, then another. Darkness returned, thicker than before. Japanese command now understood the danger. This was not reckless aggression. It was calculated compression. The Allied captain had deliberately forced the engagement into a space where procedure could not keep up, where torpedo doctrine lost its elegance, where the faster gun cycle dictated tempo. The cruiser was not surviving because it was invulnerable. It was surviving because it had denied the enemy time. And in night naval combat, time is the most valuable resource afloat. The knife-fight cruiser had turned distance from shield into liability. And the Japanese escorts, built for measured lethality at range, were now fighting a battle measured in seconds. By the time Japanese command accepted that only a single cruiser was attacking, the escort screen had already lost cohesion. One destroyer was dead in the water. Another was withdrawing under heavy smoke. A third had misfired torpedoes and broken formation. Screens function on overlap, interlocking arcs of defense that prevent penetration. Once even one segment falters, the geometry weakens. Once two fail, it collapses. The Allied cruiser sensed it. Instead of withdrawing after initial success, the captain pushed deeper, cutting directly across what had once been the convoy's protected perimeter. Engines roared at flank speed. The hull vibrated with the strain of acceleration, but speed at this range was survivability. Japanese escorts attempted to reform. But reformation under fire requires clarity, and clarity had evaporated. Signals were delayed, searchlights flickered uncertainly, radar contacts overlapped in cluttered proximity. Each captain made rapid, localized decisions without synchronized timing. The Allied cruiser exploited the fracture mercilessly. Main battery fire shifted target to target in rapid succession, three-gun groupings hammering exposed superstructures. Secondary batteries swept decks with relentless rhythm. At under 2,000 yards now, shell flight time was nearly instantaneous. There was no waiting for correction. Every flash meant impact. A final Japanese escort attempted a bold counter, closing the distance even further to launch torpedoes in desperation. For a moment, the two ships rushed toward each other in mutual aggression. The Allied cruiser fired first. A direct hit detonated near the forward torpedo mounts. Flame burst outward violently. The destroyer's bow dipped as steam vented upward. Its launch attempt died before tubes could clear. The knife fight had become one-sided. Inside the convoy, transports began evasive turns too late to matter. Their speed was insufficient to escape. Without an intact escort screen, they were exposed to the cruiser's path. But the Allied captain did not linger to slaughter. He had achieved the objective. The escorts were neutralized, the formation shattered. The conv no longer possessed organized defense. Staying longer would invite reinforcement. He ordered withdrawal. Not cautiously, but decisively. The cruiser cut away at high speed, leaving burning escorts and disorganized transports in its wake. Radar contact from Japanese ships remained confused, inconsistent, still recalibrating from the shock of compressed engagement. The knife fight had lasted minutes. But in those minutes, Doctrine had been overturned. Japanese command had prepared for a distant duel, structured, deliberate, torpedo-driven. Instead, they were forced into an engagement where distance evaporated and aggression ruled. The screen had not failed from lack of bravery. It failed because it was never meant to fight at arm's length. And the Allied cruiser had chosen arm's length deliberately. In modern naval warfare, sometimes the boldest move is not to extend range, but to destroy it. When the Allied cruiser broke contact, the night did not quiet immediately. Burning destroyers lit the sea in erratic orange pulses. Ammunition cooked off in sharp, irregular flashes. Survivors clung to debris while signal lamps blinked uselessly between ships no longer aligned. The Convoy had not been annihilated, but it had been stripped of protection. Japanese command attempted to reassemble control through secondary channels. Orders were relayed cautiously. Remaining escorts moved inward to cover transports, abandoning outward patrol arcs entirely. The posture had reversed. Instead of projecting strength outward, the formation now curled inward defensively. That shift mattered. Convoy doctrine is built on confidence in perimeter. Once that perimeter collapses, even briefly, the psychology changes. Ships maneuver more conservatively. Commanders hesitate before committing aggressively. Every radar contact is treated with suspicion. The Allied cruiser had not needed to sink the Convoy outright. It had broken its structure. And structure, once fractured under fire, rarely restores itself cleanly in the same engagement. By the time dawn approached, the Convoy was no longer advancing confidently west. It was regrouping. Reports that reached Japanese command were difficult to categorize. Enemy force, 1 cruiser. Engagement duration, minutes. Escort losses, significant. Range at contact, extremely close. That final detail carried weight. Night surface doctrine within the Imperial Japanese Navy emphasized torpedo superiority and controlled engagement distance. Destroyers were trained to dominate the night, not be surprised inside it. The Allied cruiser had inverted the equation. By collapsing range immediately, it denied torpedo geometry time to mature. By firing rapidly and continuously, it imposed tempo instead of reacting to it. This was not a failure of equipment. It was a failure of expectation. Japanese command had prepared for disciplined, mid-range exchanges. They had not fully anticipated an opponent willing to abandon standoff caution and gamble on compression. That compression had worked, and once proven effective, it would force doctrinal reconsideration. Closing distance is dangerous. It exposes armor. It reduces maneuver space. It increases vulnerability to torpedoes. But it also reduces reaction time. At long range, both sides calculate, they refine, they anticipate, engagement becomes procedural. At knife fight range, calculation shrinks to instinct. The Allied cruiser's captain understood that advantage lay not in heavier armor or larger guns, but in tempo dominance. If he could force the engagement into seconds instead of minutes, the enemy's doctrine would struggle to function. And it did. The cruiser's radar allowed precise firing even at close range. Its rapid gun cycle ensured that every hesitation was punished immediately. Destroyers attempting textbook maneuvers found themselves struck before execution completed. The weapon was not merely steel. It was compression. By sunrise, smoke columns marked where escorts had fought hardest. The convoy still existed, ships still moved, but the formation was looser now, less confident, more cautious. The Allied cruiser had vanished into open water before reinforcement could arrive. And that disappearance amplified the shock. The engagement had been brief, violent, and asymmetric. One cruiser had pressed into a formation designed to repel distant threats, and survived. Japanese captains reviewing the battle would recognize the uncomfortable truth. Distance does not guarantee safety. Sometimes it guarantees complacency. The knife-fight cruiser did not win through superior numbers. It won through decisiveness. Modern naval warfare had entered an era where radar erased darkness as a barrier, but Doctrine still assumed engagement envelopes that preserved time for alignment. The Allied captain chose to eliminate that envelope entirely. By forcing proximity, he turned Japanese torpedo doctrine from advantage into liability. Spread patterns require distance. Precision requires seconds. He removed both. The result was not annihilation. It was dislocation. The night had promised distance. The cruiser denied it. In minutes, the escort screen collapsed, not because it lacked courage, but because it was never meant to fight inside its own reaction window. Close-range naval combat is chaotic, brutal, compressed. It rewards aggression over patience. The Allied cruiser chose aggression deliberately, closing into knife-fight distance, where radar precision and rapid fire could dominate before torpedoes aligned. Japanese command had prepared for a duel at range. They received a brawl in darkness. The lesson was stark. In modern naval warfare, sometimes the most decisive move is not to extend engagement, but to erase the space that makes Doctrine comfortable. And on that October night in 1944, one cruiser proved just how lethal that decision could be.